This video is going to be one where I jibber-jab for a while on a topic with minimal quotations or clips or sources, because it's less about analyzing an event or somebody else's idea, and more about presenting my own idea. For this kind of video, I used to use this artwork, but at this point I've moved away from this kind of thing and more into the animated backgrounds. No, it's not because Butters made me look like a gorilla. That's got nothing to do with it. Today, we're going to explore the phrase harm reduction. It's a phrase that is almost always used in the context of recreational drug use. Harmreduction.org, the website of the National Harm Reduction Coalition, defines harm reduction as a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing negative consequences associated with drug use, and also a movement for social justice built on a belief in and respect for the rights of people who use drugs. Harm reduction incorporates a spectrum of strategies that include safer use, managed use, abstinence, meeting people who use drugs where they're at, and addressing conditions of use along with the use itself. Because harm reduction demands that interventions and policies designed to serve people who use drugs reflect specific individual and community needs, there is no universal definition of or formula for implementing harm reduction. Listen, if this is a social justice movement, I already expected to disregard that individual component of their philosophy. But at the same time, therapy to get over addictions, hell, therapy for almost anything, always has to be individually tailored for the person for it to work. So I wonder how they deal with the discrepancy. But it's that earlier list that's much more interesting to me. Firstly, abstinence is pretty much the solution to everything, believe it or not. The issue is that if they're already tempted, almost nobody can stick to abstinence. It works for drugs, for sex, for overeating, for pretty much everything. Generally, if you don't do the behavior that you consider to be toxic, you won't suffer the effects of having done it. It seems pretty obvious, right? It is, of course, not so simple. Consider your average religious straight man who views being gay as a sin. From his point of view, having gay sex is a bad behavior, but he's not tempted to do it, so abstaining from that behavior is actually pretty easy. But a drug addict who wants to stop doing drugs, or a fat person who wants to stop overeating, a sex addict who wants to stop having sex, it's not easy at all. It's the correct thing to do, but it's not easy. And by the way, child molesters who want to stop molesting children can be put in this boat too. Obviously, we have very good reasons to consider them monstrous. I'm not against that. But the difference between a normal person who is not attracted to kids and a child molester isn't just a moral one. In other words, if you were the exact same person but you just had a lower moral fiber, there's no reason to expect that you'd go off and diddle kids yourself. It's not like we all desire sex with children and our superior moral sense is what prevents us from doing it, even though some pedos might actually believe that to be the case. We don't do it because we don't want to, regardless of our moral views. If you actually have the desire to fuck kids and only your morality prevents you from doing so, well, good job on that, I guess. But that's not the majority of humanity. Anyway, that's the abstinence position. Entirely correct, but hard to do. The second point is safer use and managed use. This is where you get shit like San Francisco handing out clean needles, and Vancouver handing out safe supply of heroin or whatever, as if there could ever be such a thing. The idea behind this is, if people are going to use drugs anyway, we should make it as safe as possible to do so that the harm done is minimized. I understand the logic. If a heroin user has a clean needle, then they're only doing heroin, not doing heroin along with spreading bloodborne infections like hepatitis or HIV. The issue is, of course, that the people who advocate for harm reduction have forgotten that the path to actually kicking an addiction is often not enabling the addiction, but limiting it. There are some people out there who aren't in too deep yet. These people, if suddenly their supply of drugs was too hard to get or too unsafe to use, they'd be able to give it up. But if some dumbfuck hipster prog is on the street corner handing out clean needles and drugs as a part of a harm reduction program, that guy's chances of kicking the habit are basically zero. Then there are some people who are in way too deep. These are people who, even if there is no safe supply, they'll just say, fuck it, I'll go shoot up with the HIV needle in the trap house. For these people, the harm reduction view might make some sense, but it can still ultimately act as a barrier preventing them from getting their lives together. Most people who manage to overcome their addictions do so only after suffering a major loss. Hitting rock bottom, it's colloquially called, though I don't really like that term, because things can always get worse no matter how bad they currently are. But you know what I mean, a drug user might need to get arrested before he decides to seriously give it up. A fat guy might need to suffer a heart attack before he starts getting in shape. You know, stuff like this. That kind of stark realization that your actions have consequences, and you are about to suffer those consequences right now, that is a splash of cold water in the face that care and coddling cannot replicate. Some people don't survive their encounter with rock bottom. Some people become desensitized to being at rock bottom, such that major catastrophes become everyday occurrences to them. These aren't good outcomes either, obviously, but because harm reduction principles prevent people from ever reaching that rock bottom, out of a desire to prevent those two worse outcomes, they also prevent people from reaching the better outcome, the one where you shake off the shackles on your own. Let me try to visualize it. If we start at the top, pre-addiction, and we work our way to the bottom as addiction progresses, hitting that low point gives us one of two options. Either we stay there, or we die, or we recover and we move upward. Harm reduction prevents us from ever hitting those worse options, but they also enable and prolong the addiction, preventing us from also having that transformative event, from moving through hell and coming out the other side. The counter to this, from the harm reduction camp, however, is a strong one, and it's where we get to that third point, meeting people who use drugs where they're at and addressing conditions of use. Clearly, if, for example, you have an alcoholic who's been drinking because he lost his job and lost his girlfriend, it's not entirely clear if he's strictly an alcoholic, especially if he stops drinking after getting his job and his girlfriend back. A lot of harm reductionists view rock bottom as a myth. There's never any glaring sign in the moment that you've hit rock bottom. That's something that you can only realize after you've recovered. So you should start simply improving now incrementally, and then look back on your journey later and then evaluate it. And like I said before, things can always be worse. Is getting discovered by your mom with a needle hanging out of your arm really rock bottom? It might be. But it can always get worse. Imagine getting arrested for it. Imagine going to jail, being homeless, being estranged from everybody you care about. Any moment can be a rock bottom, even if there are theoretical worse moments. And there are always theoretical worse moments. I've talked in recent videos about the power of incremental change, and about how socialists aim for the utopia and become embittered that reality doesn't conform to their standards. Making a positive move every day, rather than immediately leaping to the end without the ability to stay there, is often better for you because when you do finally reach the end of the journey, your chance of relapsing is a whole lot less. It would seem to me that the abstinence position is the utopian one, the leaping to the end one, and the meet people where they're at position is the incremental one. That's 1 point for the harm reductionists. But at the same time, does it really seem realistic that if you give a heroin addict a safe supply of heroin, that your action will someday lead him to not using heroin? Or will he just keep coming to you as his new supplier? If you start to wean him off of the heroin, will he complain? Will he just find somebody else? Have you only prolonged his suffering? How do you know that the heroin addict that you're supplying is actually moving towards bettering himself, and is actually willing to use less and less and less of your safe supply every time you see him, and he's not just getting his fix with no aim towards improvement? If your answer is, take him at his word, I don't think you've ever spoken to a junkie before. And if your answer is, it doesn't matter if he ever gets better, at least he's not getting worse, then I refer you back to my visualization. Why would we take actions that stagnate people in no man's land, just because some of them would not survive the trials ahead? Is it better to exist in limbo, coddled by those who supply you, or to roll the dice and take a chance on being your own man again? This visualization works for so many things beyond drug use. It works to describe people who simply exist as a wagee while living at the whims of other people, versus those who try to start their own businesses, where some may fail and some may succeed. It works to describe people who are too scared to try and find partners, versus people who put themselves out there and get rejected and get laid. This is a map of people who are risk adverse versus risk takers in general. Risk takers don't do it simply because of the high risk, high reward aspect, though that's certainly a part of it, but there's also non-material motivations. Some people want to have the pride in standing on their own 2 feet. Some people want freedom, some people want control, and encountering the risk itself is its own thrill as well. I don't know if harm reduction policies actually work all that well. Intuitively, I would have to say probably not, but rationally, I think it depends on what kind of person you're dealing with. Some people are able to wean themselves off their addiction with a nudge in the right direction. Some people need to burn their lives down before they figure it out. It's a fundamental difference in personality, and simply saying, give them safe supply is a one-size-fits-all solution to an individualist problem. Haha, remember when I said they'd have to abandon the individualist position? But we've moved off the addiction conversation and more towards a risk-adverse conversation. And that's appropriate because while harm reduction is a phrase overwhelmingly used in the context of addiction, commies and progs have also adopted it to refer to their politics. They use it to refer to healthcare for obvious reasons. They use it to refer to sex work, saying that prostitutes are forced into the job by their material conditions and we shouldn't be making it any worse for them. They use it to refer to just a general push towards socialism, because the total harm of the world is reduced if we harm 1% of the population by stealing their stuff and distributing it to the 99%, alleviating all of their harm. But is that really acceptable? Hurting a group, not because they deserve it, not giving them any justice or recompense for it, but because doing so will help some larger group? Would we accept that if we were talking about a race or an ethnicity? We've already rejected that logic throughout our history multiple times now. The socialist counter to this argument is that unlike the Jews and the Germans, or the blacks and the whites, the 1% does actually harm the 99%. And that's when you go down the commie rabbit hole of employment is actually exploitation. The worker cannot consent to having his surplus value stripped of him by his boss because the alternative is starvation. Starvation is the gun that capital owners hold to the head of the proletariat. So let's examine the proposition. Harm reduction. What counts as harm? In fact, leftoids will ask the question, where is the harm all the time, when trying to justify their objections to conservative views on traditional morality. And you know what? That's actually a fair question to ask. But let's start with the dictionary definition and then work out from there. For the normies, harm is defined as physical injury, especially that which is deliberately inflicted. My prog sensors are already going off. They would most certainly view wrong speech as harmful, so let's remove that word physical. Now the definition is injury, especially that which is deliberately inflicted. Any leftoid worth their weight in sex positivity will bring up the BDSM example, where people regularly harm each other during sex. The difference there is that those people are consenting, so the concept of consent needs to be added to the definition. If you consent, it's not harm. Now the definition looks like injury, especially that which is deliberately inflicted without consent. We already know that socialists disregard consent if they believe that power dynamics are at play. You can't truly consent to employment, even if you enthusiastically want to work, because of the dynamic between worker and boss. However, this is ultimately a carbon copy of the radical feminist view on consent. According to those people, women cannot truly consent to sex with men because of the power dynamics at play between women and men. Most sex-positive socialists will reject this argument by saying that despite the man-woman power dynamic, a woman having sex with a man that she consents to do it with, that act is still in her interest. The interest being, in this case, the sex that she wants to have. But the interest of the worker is always diametrically opposed to the interest of the boss, and so employment can never be consensual, no matter how enthusiastic. So now the concept of interest is introduced to the definition. In order to include these cases, the definition of harm must now read something like injury against the interest of the injured party. The inclusion of interest subsumes deliberate infliction, as you can still be surprised at a random circumstance that is for or against your interests, and still be hurt or not hurt by it. Interest also subsumes consent, as the leftist has already admitted that consent against your interest is invalid, while consent in your interest is valid. That's the difference between the man-woman scenario and the worker-boss scenario. And this definition tracks not only with employment and sex, but also, say, with suicide, where we can frame the suicidal person as not acting in their own interest, despite clearly consenting to take their own life. It can also track with working out, where working out can certainly inflict harm, but it's also in your interest to do so. So, if the leftist definition of harm is something approximating an injury against the interest of the injured party, harm reduction, in a political sense, not just with the drugs, ends up coming out as something like reducing injuries not in my interest. In other words, harm reduction simply means minimizing things that I don't like. It's harm reduction to spread rumors about people who might oppose me, whether or not those rumors are true. It's harm reduction to ensure that my political opponents lose an election, whether it happens fairly or not. It's harm reduction to do what it takes to win, even if the win is illegitimate.
You call it selling out your principles. I call it fucking winning. And that's my principle. To win.
Okay, I know it's like the third time in the row that I use that clip. I won't use it again. You get the point. The ultimate problem with the question, where is the harm, isn't that it doesn't sometimes uncover some good context. It certainly does. The problem is that it's not the right question to ask. When examining a course of action, you shouldn't be saying where is the harm, but where is the virtue. It's not about figuring out which action is the least bad, so you can calculate how much bad you can get away with. It's about figuring out which action is actually good. Harm reduction is constantly putting out fires without ever actually contributing towards a positive vision. I did that video recently called The Crime of Being, where I described how what lies at the very bottom of the socialist ethic is a hatred of having been born, and how the left is just constantly miserable all the time. And it's like, yes, obviously, all you do is talk about how much you need to harm reduce your way to the utopia, as if there is any utopia in the mediocrity of perpetuating a limbo. There is no positive vision of the future here. There's no less junkies, there's only cleaner needles. I like Merrick. She's one of the few commies online that I can stand for any length of time, but in the past month I've randomly tuned into 3 of her streams, and each time it's been about how depressed and tired she is with politics. At the same time, Taftadge recently clued me into Bo Burnham Inside, where Burnham's 2 jokes are basically just, I'm depressed and I'm progressive. Is there any fucking wonder that leftoids are like this? They don't have a positive, achievable vision of the future. They spend all their time putting out fires by pouring gasoline on them. They have no ability to actually think towards the future. They only see the immediate issues right in front of them. In Hoppian terms, they have a low time preference. Very quickly, time preference is a concept in economics. ANCAPs love it, but it's actually pretty universally applicable, describing a rational actor's focus regarding relative valuation. If you have a low time preference, you're more likely to shoot for short-term gain. And if the future isn't guaranteed, then this is the most rational position. Get while the getting's good. Don't save up resources for a future that may not exist. If you have a high time preference, you are more likely to delay gratification in order to receive a larger payout. This is where you're working hard and saving and investing for the future. Having a low time preference is something that a leftist would have. They believe the world is going to end within the next decade, and that the only thing that they can do is try to reduce the amount of harm, even if it creates more harm in the future, because the future is hell, and anything they build up will be destroyed anyway. It's an apocalyptic vision that I don't think is actually going to come to pass, but it explains a lot of leftoid behavior. If the world isn't actually going to end within our lifetimes, the meta-leftist worldview is irrational and self-destructive and ultimately makes society a whole lot worse, which is why we are where we are. We've got tons of people out there all doing stuff that, to any normal human being, is completely ridiculous. Why are you giving out heroin to addicts? But from within their apocalyptic frame, it makes perfect sense. A lot of other leftist moves within education or activism or whatever else are downstream from getting as many people as possible to buy into the death cult. And if you don't buy in, they can always fall back on calling you a racist. Forget all of that. Forget being called a racist if you don't self-destruct. If you're deciding on your next course of action, ask yourself not where is the harm, but instead where is the virtue. You get to decide what the virtue is you're pursuing. Are you trying to study and get through school? Are you trying to lose some body fat? Kick a bad habit? Your conscience will tell you what you need to pursue, if you're willing to listen to it. And then you judge your actions based on that standard. Not somebody else's standard, not where is the harm. That's the wrong question to ask. If you have to hem and haw about whether or not some vice impedes your progress, or does it really hurt that badly, that should be a warning sign to you. Discover what you want, and then pursue it.